I'm with Massimo Pigliucci, man with 2 PhDs, one in evolutionary biology and one in philosophy. He's the author of several books, with a recent book, How to Be a Stoic, professor of philosophy at the City College of New York, and formerly the co-host of a show that I still enjoy with Julia Gala, Rationally Speaking. Massimo, I don't know what I've left off, probably a lot, but thank you for being with me.
That's okay. Don't thanks him. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm interested, of course, to talk about Stoicism, as I mentioned. And of course, you seem to be ripe for the picking in terms of candidates for who might be able to talk about it. And I'd like to get into what led you to practicing Stoicism. It might be the same as so many other academics of philosophy that I've spoken to, where you can't avoid Stoicism, so you're introduced to it, and then it becomes just ingrained in you. But I'd like to get your take.
Actually, no, I definitely did not get into it from the academic route, partly because, as you mentioned, I started my career as a biologist, and I was a biologist for like close to 25 years. When I switched to philosophy, it was not because of my interest in Stoicism. It was because I was getting more and more interested in sort of conceptual issues in biology and in science more generally. So those conceptual issues started bordering on philosophy of science. And I started publishing papers in philosophy of science. And so I said, hey, you know what? I'm in the middle of my career at that time. I was in the middle of my career. So I was like, maybe it's going to be a fun thing to do, to go back to school, get a PhD in philosophy, and actually completely switch fields. So that's how I got into philosophy. Stoicism happened a little later. It turns out that I was in the middle of a mild midlife crisis. A few things that happened that I didn't necessarily expect. I was going through a divorce, which was unexpected. My father died. That was in the same year, in fact, a few months apart from each other. Got a new job, which meant moving to a different city and getting a new house and new colleagues and everything. Now, any decent psychologist will tell you that one of those events in a given year is fairly stressful.
Sure.
When you get 4 or 5 of those in the same, span of a few months, it's like, oh, hold on a second here.
It's a heavy cognitive load, yeah.
Right. It's a heavy cognitive load. And so then I turned to what at the time was my philosophy of life for help, because that's what philosophies of life are supposed to do, right? And my philosophy of life was secular-humanism. And it was utterly useless. It's just like, it did not help at all. And the reason for that is not because I disagree with the tenets of secular humanism. I completely agree with that kind of outlook on life. The problem is that if I keep repeating to myself that I'm in favor of human rights and that we should live in a more just society and we should use reason and science, those are the tenets of secular humanism. Yeah, fine, but I'm getting a divorce. What does that got to do with anything?
So it's like you could recite secular humanistic values to death, right?
Right, but they're not going to do anything in terms of, okay, yes, but how am I going to deal with the particular situation that I have right now?
Yeah.
Obviously, I wasn't going to go back to religion. I grew up in Italy, in Rome, so I was by default, I was a Catholic, and I left the religion and embraced secular humanism when I was in my teenage years because it didn't make any sense to me. And so it's like, okay, now I'm not going back there. So now what? And then I thought, oh, well, you've been studying philosophy as a professional. Surely, if there is a place you can look, that's going to be philosophy, right? I systematically started looking at different philosophies of life with the notion that what I needed was some kind of framework that was not only a general view of life like secular humanism is, but actually also practical, that I could actually carry into day-to-day life, not only when there is a crisis, such as a divorce or your father dying, but also, in regular everyday life. So I started with Buddhism because a lot of my friends said, you should look into Buddhism.
Yeah.
I said, okay, let's look into Buddhism. It didn't speak to me. The Buddhism ethics is actually very interesting and it's well thought out. And as it turns out, it actually has a lot of similarities with Stoicism, I discovered later. But I couldn't get over the metaphysics. I mean, no, sorry, karma, reincarnation. No, that's not gonna. That, as I said, I left Christianity early on for similar reasons. So that was out. Besides, the language was alien to me. That simply for cultural reasons. I didn't grow up in that sort of society. So it's like, okay, interesting, but no, thanks. Then it occurred to me that virtue ethics was going to be the area, the general ballpark where the answer is going to be. Why? Well, because modern ethics, like things like Kantian style deontology or utilitarianism, those are kind of universal approaches to ethics. They really work if they work. I actually have doubt that they work, but if they do work, they work at the level of how to structure a society. But in terms of, again, of personal issues, like, no, that's not gonna
tactical.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, so virtue ethics, on the other hand, has the advantage that if it's focused in what I think is the right direction, which is on the character of the individual. Right? Virtue ethics don't simply ask themselves, is this action right or wrong? They actually ask more broadly, are you working toward becoming a better person? Are you actually improving yourself? Because then if you become a better person, presumably you're going to figure out what is the right thing to do or not, right? So I said, okay, virtue ethics it is. Great, let's plunge into it. First stop, obviously, had to be Aristotle. Because, the Nicomachean Ethics, that's the classic founding, text of virtue ethics. And I looked at it, lots of interesting things, but it's like, yeah, but hold on a second. Aristotle tells us that in order to live a eudaimonic life, a life worth living, you have to practice virtue. You have to, improve yourself. It's great. That's a yes. But you also need a number of other things in order to flourish, including, health, a little bit of education, a little bit of wealth, a little bit of money, good looks. I say, okay, that seems like a little too aristocratic for my taste. It's like that excludes like 2/3 of the world, to say the least. So that is interesting, but it's not going to work.
So like Aristotelian virtue ethics starts you at a place of good moral luck.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of moral luck involved. In the concept of moral luck is very pertinent there, right? And in fact, and I think to some extent, to be fair to Aristotle, the difference is that all the ancient schools of philosophy use the word eudaimonia as the life that it's essentially you're looking at, that you want to live that kind of life. Now the problem is that they all cashed it out differently. So when often eudaimonia these days is translated as flourishing, but that biases things, in my opinion, in favor of Aristotle. Because yes, I would agree with Aristotle that if the goal is to flourish, then yes, I do need money, good looks, education, and so on and so forth. But there are broader versions of, broadest translations of eudaimonia, the life worth living. Now, it turns out that a life worth living may not be necessarily a life of flourishing. If you're lucky, you flourish. But that doesn't mean that your life is not worth living if you're not actually flourishing. My typical example, my obvious example is, in the modern times, somebody like Nelson Mandela did not flourish. He spent 27 years in prison. That's not flourishing. But I challenge anybody to tell me that Nelson Mandela's life was not worth living, right? So, or Socrates himself, he was ugly as they could come, apparently. Right. So, so much for good looks. And yet, again, I challenge anybody to tell me that Socrates' life was not worth living. He was penniless, or drachma-less, I suppose I should say. So, from an Aristotelian point of view, Aristotle would have said that Socrates is like, no, that's not a good life. And yet, I think it really was. So, setting Aristotle aside, the next to the last stop was Epicurus, because other secular humanists actually are into Epicurus for a number of reasons. First of all, because even though he was not an atheist, he actually said, you shouldn't worry about the gods because God is over there thinking about himself, thinking stuff. It doesn't really care about human beings. There's no, it's useless to pray, that sort of stuff. It's like, forget it. Also, more importantly, you should not be afraid of death, because as he famously put it, where she is, you are not, and vice versa. And in fact, all these stories that you hear about the afterlife, they're all made up by priests and poets who want to take advantage of you and control you. It's like, okay, so you can see why
get on board,
popular with secular humanity. Also, he was an atomist, right? So he believed that the world is a bunch of atoms colliding to each other. So it was a materialist in a sense. So that goes fairly well with modern science, et cetera, et cetera. Great. So I looked into Epicurus. I liked all of that, what I just mentioned. I also liked the notion that Epicureans are very much into the importance of friendship in life. The Epicurean goal, and they are into, pursuing small pleasures. they do have the reputation of being the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of philosophy, but that's actually not true at all.
I have heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, they go into after very small local pleasures, so that all of that looks good, except that then you get to, for the Epicurean, a eudaimonic life is a life of no pain, both physical and especially mental pain. Okay, but that means, says Epicurus, that one of the things you don't want to do is to get involved socially or politically, because social political involvement, as we all know, carries pain. And I said, all right, I'm out, because I don't think a life worth living, actually, at least for me, is one where there is no social political involvement. So it's like, that was out. So now we got 4 down, right? Buddhism, Aristotelianism, Epicureanism, psychohumanism, of course.
It seems like what they all have in common is that they're the definitions of what makes for a decent life in those philosophies went from grand to a little smaller to a little smaller. Right. You haven't honed in on a personal philosophy yet.
Right. So there I was, and then at some point I saw this thing appear on my Twitter feed, of all places, that says this message that says, help us celebrate Stoic Week. I said, the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because, of course, at the time, I had the common misconception that the Stoics are like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, like, suppressing your emotions, stiff upper lip. It's like, as much as I love Spock, like, no, I don't think that's a particularly good life for a human being. But then I stopped and I said, wait a minute, hold on a second. But Stoicism, too, is a type of virtue ethics. And in fact, the Stoics, so who were the Stoics? Oh, Marcus Aurelius. Well, I read the Meditations when I was in college, and it's like, I liked it. I thought it was an interesting, thought-provoking book. And also Seneca, right? When I was in high school, I actually translated Seneca from Latin, and he was a great writer. It's like, it was a lot of fun. So, but somehow I never put the two together. I never actually thought that Seneca and Marcus Aurelius were talking about the same stuff, let alone that they were talking about a practical philosophy of life. So maybe actually I should take a look at Stoicism and see what happens. So I signed up for Stoic Week. I downloaded their material, started reading and practicing Stoicism. And the very first thing that I read is right at the beginning of Epictetus' Discourses. And at the beginning of Discourses, Epictetus says, so, at some point we have to die, but it looks like that's not going to happen today. On the other hand, I'm hungry, so let's go out and have lunch. It's like, what? Who is this guy? Well, this is somebody who has a sense of humor. He talks in a very straightforward way, no nonsense kind of thing. And I never heard of him, even though I have a PhD in philosophy. How is that even possible? So I started looking a little bit more carefully. Turns out Epictetus actually was a household name throughout the centuries, throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and all the way into the 19th century. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, all of them had copies of the Enchiridion, which is the other book by Epictetus. So it's not actually by Epictetus, it's by one of his students, but nevertheless, about Epictetus' teachings. And I thought, so that's interesting. So the Epictetus' names then eventually went into a kind of a little bit of an eclipse during the 20th century, but we're trying to bring him back. In fact, the latest book that I wrote, A Field Guide to a Happy Life, is really an homage to Epictetus, because I think that people really need to know about Epictetus. He's a great guy. And I'm reading now, incidentally, before I finish the story, I'm reading now a novel that came out in the 90s by Thomas Wolfe. It's called Men in Full. And one of the characters changes his life in prison because he discovers, by chance, Epictetus and starts reading it.
This is strange. Sorry, probably has no value, but it's really strange. I was watching somehow the zeitgeist has happened, a YouTube clip of Thomas Wolfe being interviewed by Letterman about that book last night.
There you go.
Anyway,
the universe is trying to tell us.
Yeah. Right? The Stoic guys.
So, long story short, I got into Stoicism for a week, and then I said, this is really great. Let me look into it more carefully. So I committed to practice for another couple of months. Usually Stoic Week is in October, so a couple more months is at the end of the year. And then I said, this is really working well. for me. So let's commit for another year. And now here I am, several years later, I'm talking to you.
And it's working out well?
It is working out well, especially in the middle of a pandemic, as you might imagine. No, it's been working well because, so my friends and family tell me that I get much less upset and angry about things than compared to what I used to. Certainly having become a sage, I do still get upset and angry occasionally, but much less so than used to be. I have a much better perspective on things. I can handle problems and setbacks more appropriately. It's like, let me give you an example. During the pandemic, this was early on. It was like sometime in the spring. So my wife and I live here in an apartment in Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn, and all of a sudden the refrigerator stopped working. Okay, well, we can replace the refrigerator, except that the building where we live did not allow at the time delivery of appliances because it was in the middle of the peak of the pandemic in New York. It's like, no delivery at all. It's like, oh, crap. So now we are facing a pandemic, a situation where you want to have food stored without a refrigerator or a freezer. That's not good. Now, instead of sort of panicking, getting upset and started yelling and all that sort of stuff, we both looked at each other and we said, so what would Epictetus do? And of course, the first thing that Epictetus would do is would remind you that certain things are under your control and other things are not under your control. Right. Getting a refrigerator delivered, it's not under your control. Sorry, that's not in the cards. What is under our control? Well, for one thing, we could, for some time at least, switch our diet to mostly dry and canned foods. Right, so we can go out still to the grocery store, get a bunch of cans of stuff, beans and stuff like that, pasta, rice, stuff like that, and we can certainly live okay for the foreseeable future. Second, what is under our control is to check with the management company of the building and asking, okay, this is our problem. We know that you cannot. You don't allow delivery of appliances, but is there any other suggestion you have? And they said, well, we actually do allow delivery of small things like, dorm-sized refrigerators. Oh, great. That's better than nothing. So we got one of those, and that helped at least, with fresh produce and things like that. And we were just fine for the several weeks that it took eventually for the pandemic to sort of subside a little bit, the building to reopen, and now we have a perfectly functioning new refrigerator. So under different conditions, if we had not, both my wife and I practiced Stoicism, if we had not approached things in that way, we would have been pissed off and yelling and probably arguing with each other and being pissed at the management company, at the universe that had sent us the pandemic. None of that happened. It saved a lot of energy and time, and emotional distress and all that sort of stuff. We just said, okay, so let's see what we can do given the situation. And we did, and it worked. So there are countless examples of this kind of attitude that really changes things very practically, very, very, very dramatically in some cases.
It's interesting how beneficial it's been for you. And at the same time, when you were going through a period of stress, you seem to know at least what the kind of framework was that you needed in your life in order to make a lifestyle for yourself.
Yes, but even there, that's right. That's true. But even there, I knew it because I had just recently been through a PhD program in philosophy, where, of course, even though my specialty, as I said, is philosophy of science, and so I was focused mostly on the kind of courses that are pertinent there: philosophy of science, logic, epistemology, that sort of stuff. But it was a PhD program in philosophy, so you had to take other courses as well, including mandated one course on ancient philosophy, Greek philosophy, and one course on ethics. So yes, you're right. The framework was there, but the framework was in itself the result of the fact that I was much more familiar with philosophy than I had been before.
So in that scenario you just gave, I mean, you talked about an application of Stoicism and how it's helped you. And it sounds like you talk. What is it called? The dichotomy of control. Is that what that? I've heard of this mentioned. Like the tactic itself has been applied in several different areas. Some call themselves Stoics, some don't. I'm curious if you know about the work of Ellen Langer.
No,
she a lady who worked. Actually, she's the first female chair of psychology at Harvard.
Okay.
And she, in colloquial terms, people call her the mother of mindfulness. And she took the same issue with Buddhism as you did. And of course, she took the same issue with maybe a westernized, commercialized mindfulness track as maybe you do. And so she tried to figure out what are the fundamentals of mindfulness. What does it mean? What are you after? And it cashed out to be something like Stoicism. So I guess if you don't know, her, then you wouldn't be able to answer. But I'm curious to know, is there something about mindfulness and Stoicism that are fundamentally incompatible, or are they sort of just cut from the same cloth and under a different name?
So let me give you a couple of answers. Remind me in a minute to go back to mindfulness, because I think it is important. Yeah. But before we get there, so the dichotomy of control, that notion is actually found in a number of different philosophies. I found traces of it in 8th century Buddhism, 11th century Judaism, and there's the most famous probably connection is with 20th century Christianity, the Serenity Prayer. This is a prayer that is usually invoked at the beginning of meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And the prayer, I never remember the exact wording, but the prayer basically asks God to give you the wisdom to tell the difference between what you can change and what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot. Well, that's essentially Epictetus. And I don't think it's by chance, because the Enchiridion, the manual by Epictetus, was actually translated in Latin several times. It was updated throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. In fact, it was used as a training manual for Christian monks throughout the Middle Ages. So I don't think it's a chance that that kind of stuff just sort of reemerges. You're right that it's often called the dichotomy of control. I believe, I'm not absolutely positive, but I believe that that term actually comes from Bill Irvine, one of the modern Stoics, writers in Stoicism. However, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer, because it's not really about control. Even though the beginning of the Enchiridion sometimes is translated as saying some things are under your control and other things are not under your control. Actually, the best translation that I've found is some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. Meaning, for some things, the buck stops with us, with me, and for others it doesn't. That doesn't mean control. It's a little bit of a strong word here, but basically what Epictetus says, like, look, at the end of the day, the only things that are really up to us are your judgments, and nothing else, really. Okay, your judgments means your decisions to act or not to act on certain things, how you think about certain issues, and your values, your endorsed values. You explicitly endorse values. Those are things that are clearly up to you, meaning nobody can tell you to change them. They can try to influence you. They can try to even force you to change them. But ultimately, if I say, I think racism is the best invention since, best thing since sliced bread, that's my opinion. And you are right to hold me accountable to that opinion. I can't just say, well, but I heard it from somewhere else. Right. Or, a friend of mine told me it was a good idea. You can reasonably say, yeah, but you are the one that is putting forth that notion right now. It's up to you. You are responsible for it. On the other hand, pretty much everything else, according to Epictetus, is not up to us. Meaning, not that we cannot influence. For instance, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So let's talk about health. So what about my health is up to me and not up to me? Well, what is up to me is to wear a mask. That's an action, right? That derives from a judgment. I believe that wearing masks is a good idea. Washing my hands. That's an action, which derives from a judgment that washing your hands is a good thing. Social distancing, that's an action that derives from a judgment, etc., etc. What is not up to me is whether I actually do get sick or not. Right? Because I could do all of those things, I could do everything right, and yet, I can tell you as a biologist, viruses are sneaky things. They can get you, regardless of whether you do the right thing or not. Of course, the chances that I'm going to get the virus are much smaller if I do the right things, right? If I act appropriately, but there is no guarantee. So what Epictetus is telling you is that the outcomes of your actions are not a guarantee. In that sense, they're not up to you.
That's That takes care of potential limitation that I wanted to talk to you about. First of all, I should say that I was trying to look cool and know that that was called the dichotomy of control, and I thought maybe that was like a translation from from Stoic literature, but it was just Bill Urban that I had on last week.
Yes,
But
that's right.
but so he might have just said it to me a week ago, and that's so maybe I'm not so smart. Don't tip in my hand. But something I had a problem with it because we were so limited on time was if it's. I think you're right that it's a misnomer. If it's called the dichotomy of control, that bothered me because making choices and then the potential outcomes of the reasons, the basis for you doing something is not so dichotomous. I mean, you want to pine for something that maybe you can't achieve or something like that. And so I think you just answered that pretty well. Like you mentioned that you.
A better term for it that sometimes is used, not very often, unfortunately, is the Stoic fork. So the fork tells you, okay, so some things are up to me and other things are not up to me. Of course, as I said, there is a close relationship between the two. So for instance, one of the things that I actually disagree with Bill is that Bill introduces, after he talks about the dichotomy of control, he says, well, we should really talk about a trichotomy. There are things that are under our control, things that are not under our control, and then there are things that we can influence, right? But if you do that, you kind of destroy Epictetus. That's not, that's kind of a little bit of in my mind at least, a trivialization of Epictetus. Of course, Epictetus knew that there are things that we can influence. Right? It was, obviously there are. But the point is that what we call influence itself can be broken down into these two components. Like I just said, I influence my health, right?
Right.
But that influence is the result of two things. On the one hand, what's up to me, my decisions about how to act during a pandemic, and what is not up to me, the damn virus and what other people do about it, right? And the two things come together and it looks like something that I'm influencing. Yes, that's true. Now, why is all this important? Because the idea is, therefore, that we should focus on what is up to us and then develop an attitude of equanimity toward what is not up to us, right? So going back to my example of the refrigerator during a pandemic, right? My wife and I immediately focused on what was up to us. Okay, so what kind of alternative grocery shopping can we do that's going to ameliorate the problem? That's up to us. We didn't, and then we took what is not up to us with equanimity. It's like, oh, okay, I guess we're not going to have a refrigerator for the next few weeks. Fine, that's not the end of the world, right? Life will go on. Instead of getting upset, you sort of try to develop this attitude of acceptance and endurance of the things that you don't like.
Right. So things could get better. It's always in the realm of possibility, but they might not. And so I'm actually okay with right now.
Correct. You need to be prepared. Now, going back to mindfulness.
Yeah.
So there is a debate within the Stoic community about the term mindfulness because some people do talk about Stoic mindfulness, but Stoic mindfulness is very different from Buddhist mindfulness in the original Eastern tradition. And it's also very different from Westernized Buddhist mindfulness. So what Stoic mindfulness is, the term in Greek is prosoke, which actually translates as attention. It basically, the Stoics are telling you to pay attention to what you're doing right here, right now. Why would you want to do that? Well, Epictetus says, because nothing has ever been improved by not paying attention to it. And since your life is happening right here, right now, right? It's not happening in the past because the past is outside of, it's not up to you. It's done, right? It's not happening in the future because also the future is not up to you. It still has to come. It is happening right here, right now. So the best thing you can do in order to have a good life is to pay attention, be mindful of what you're doing. You should do nothing unless you're actually paying attention to it, right? And so in that sense, yes, Stoic mindfulness, I think it's a good idea. It's a great idea. So I try to practice it on a regular basis. And it's not as easy as it sounds because, it sounds trivial. It's like, of course, are you paying attention? Really? Because I see a lot of my students who try to multitask, for instance, between listening to my lecture, checking their cell phone, checking Facebook and all that. We all do that sort of stuff. We live in a society, especially now in the 21st century, where the notion of multitasking has become ingrained, even though it's not just the Stoics, it's modern neuroscience that tells you that the human brain literally cannot do multitasking.
Right.
We just cannot. Or what we do is we switch very quickly between different tasks, with the result that we're not paying proper attention to either one of them. And so we're doing both worse, right? So if I were having a conversation with you right now, but then on the side, I was kind of look at my phone to see if there's a message, and maybe there's a message from my brother. Oh, okay, I'm not answering it, but I'm reading it. Well, now I'm losing the thread of the conversation with you, and I'm paying half attention to what my brother wrote. So no, I'm going to finish my conversation with you first, and then I'm going to go to my brother's message and pay full attention to that one.
I had a conversation with Christopher Chabris, who did the Invisible Gorilla video.
Yes,
you know what I'm
that's
talking
right.
about?
Yes,
And he properly convinced me that I'm never paying this as much of attention as I think. But it sounds, when you say attention, it sounds like it has a certain meaning that maybe not everybody agrees with. I mean, it seems like it's sort of a soft attention, and also like a salience determination that you need to have about you. Whereas you could be, it's not paying attention to lots of things.
No,
because you can't do that. And it's not, you could also, I'm sure, overly concentrate on something to the extent that it's bogging you down. Is there a better way to talk about attention?
Yeah, in fact, Epictetus actually tells you what it means specifically by the word prosoke. There is a section in the Discourses which is entirely entitled on what we should pay attention to. So it's, he actually says it pretty explicit. As I said, one of the things that I like about Epictetus is that he's pretty straightforward. If you have a question, he's like, okay, there must be a section here in the Discourses where he talks about this. And sure enough, there is. So here's what it is. He says we should pay attention particularly to what he calls our impressions. Now, impression is a technical Stoic term, and it basically corresponds to your implicit judgments whenever you perceive something. So, for instance, let's say, I walk down the street and I see a very attractive person of the appropriate gender, in my case, a woman, and my immediate thought is, oh, it'll be fun to have sex with her. That's your impression, okay? So your impression is a combination of a sensorial experience. I'm seeing somebody walking down the street who has certain characteristics, and an implicit judgment. Oh, it would be, because if you say to yourself, it would be good to have sex, then that's an implicit, that's a judgment, right? And it's implicit because we normally don't bring it out, and examine it. And Epictetus says, okay, that's where you want to stop and pay attention. You want to actually talk to your impression and say, he says, you should say to your impression, you are just an impression, not necessarily the thing you pretend to be. Right? And so now you start this inner dialogue basically between you and your impression. And the dialogue might go something like that. Yeah, sure, that person is certainly of the right gender and is certainly attractive. And yes, other things being equal, I'm sure that having sex with her might be, a pleasurable thing. However, you're also in a committed relationship with a woman you love, and you also think that trust is an important thing, and therefore you obviously don't want to, betray her trust in you. So the impression needs to be rejected. The Stoics say you should deny assent to the impression.
Right. Got it.
And that is a lot of what's going on in Stoicism, especially in Epictetus' version of Stoicism. It's all about, a lot of it is about denying or affirming assent to certain things. You don't always deny. There are some, like for instance, when you contacted me or, at some point and said, I would like to have you on my podcast. Okay, my first impression might have been, oh, damn, another interview, or, oh, great, another way to talk for an hour about the things that I like, right? But then I stopped and I said, yeah, okay, hold on a second, however. This is an interesting opportunity. The guy seems like, is genuinely interested. Now, do I have the time to do that? Can I fit it in my schedule? Is it going to be, useful to people in general? After you do all that, then you assent and you say, sure, I'll do it.
I got it. So you're really taking a closer inspection of your first impression.
Correct.
There. I know you're talking about Epictetus there, but it must be shared among the Stoics. I haven't read deeply a lot of the Stoic literature, but I have read Meditations, which maybe everyone who's graduated liberal arts college has read or something.
Right.
But I just remember laughing, thinking, because it was in the morning and I was reading this section of Meditations where Marcus Aurelius is having a dialogue with himself about whether to get out of bed. It's
right.
Like, you need to, what use are you doing in here? And then talking back to himself, but it feels so nice. It's so warm and nice. And I was having that same dialogue with myself. Like you said, there's something about the Stoics that is so commonsensical and deceptively challenging to master.
Yes.
At the same time.
That's right. So the theory is fairly simple. I mean, it's really not rocket science, and it shouldn't be.
Any good theory, I feel, should be.
Yeah, exactly. Certainly any good philosophy of life should not be rocket science, because otherwise it's not accessible to the majority of people. And that's not the point. However, one thing is a theory and another one is a practice. I mean, Epictetus actually says pretty clearly to his students at some point, he says, when you are in my classroom, I see a bunch of Stoics. But then you go, I meet you in the streets and I see a bunch of Aristotelians. In other words, you're not practicing what you allegedly understood.
Right.
Because the practice is difficult, right? The practice is difficult, and it requires constant attention, again, and dedication. So sometimes people say, but isn't that asking a little too much? Isn't practicing Stoicism, difficult and demanding? And my answer is, yes, it is. But what makes you think that practicing Buddhism or Christianity is not difficult? I mean, if you want to be a real Christian, a serious Christian, not somebody who just goes through the motions, that's demanding. I mean, love your neighbor, your enemy. That's pretty demanding. That's not a minor thing. Or in the case of a Buddhist, make sure that you don't do anything that increases suffering in the world. That's easier said than done. So it's not surprise that it requires constant application and constant. But the goal is to become a better human being. And according to the Stoics, but also I think to the Christians and to the Buddhists, there is no higher goal you could possibly have.
It makes sense to me. I mean, it's the more you practice, no matter the rigor, it's enlivening. And at the same time, there's a built-in mechanism that allows you to look back on what you've done, even if you failed the practice, but you don't take the perspective of failure. You see something like, how can I improve on this? Exactly. I think,
the Stoics, especially Epictetus, use a lot the analogy with athletics. So he says, so you wanna be at the Olympics? You wanna win the laurel at the Olympics? Well, who wouldn't? Right. But are you prepared? I mean, do you really know what that means? Are you prepared to exercise every day, to sweat a lot, to eat certain foods, not to do certain things, to be thrown down in the dust, and then maybe you're not even going to win? You're going to play second or third. So it's like, it requires effort, but that's true for anything. I mean, again, using the analogy of athletics. So if you decide to go to the gym and start working out, right? Presumably, one of the first, if you know nothing about working out, one of the things you do is you go to the gym, you sign up with an instructor or with a trainer, and so that you have an idea of what you're doing, so you don't hurt yourself, so that you can come up with a program of exercise that works for you. All of that. That's the theory. But then you don't just walk out and say, "Oh well, thank you, that's it, done." Right? No, okay, that was the beginning. Now you have to actually go back every day and do it. Right? You don't just learn about how to lift weights. You actually have to lift the damn things, right? Over and over and over. Otherwise, you don't get the muscles that you want. You just get the theory.
Right. It's a way of life. And actually, that's a nice segue into one of the reasons I'm so interested in it and your work is because I coach and counsel people all the time about how to overcome addictions. And I have, I guess what my take on it is very much a cognitive behavioral one. Right. And so it does oppose a lot of calling addiction a disease. So I say that there's an element of agency and personal responsibility you can take gladly to overcome things. And I remember thinking I had a heavy workload and I lost my temper a lot. And at the same time, I have a young child. And I remember that doesn't sound that stressful, but I remember all of that coming to a head and thinking, I'm getting way too flat. I'm overwhelmed. There's way too much happening, and I'm being a horrible role model for my kid. If I'm losing my keys in the morning and flipping out, and she's seeing that. Right. So I started doing it. I didn't mean for it to be a Stoic practice or anything like that, but I would wake up at about 4:30 in the morning to get my work done for the day between 4:30 and when I went to my next job. And at the same time, I started this was just total common sense on my part. I asked myself, what would I tell a client of mine to do? And I thought, well, one thing I might do is think about the things that I have, like my daughter, and think about what life would be if she were gone. And when I told a colleague about that, he said, "Oh, so you're getting really stoic." That's my first introduction to Stoicism.
Interesting.
All that to ask, what do you see as the proper relationship between Stoicism and cognitive therapies, or what is the relationship, and how are they similar?
That's a good question. So as you probably know, cognitive behavioral therapy was actually, at least some strands of it, were actually inspired by Stoicism. Beck and Albert Ellis actually directly mentioned the Stoics. So it's no surprise that there is a connection there. Of course, then cognitive behavioral therapy evolved into its own field. It's research-based, evidence-based, et cetera, et cetera. And now there is a number of different schools of it, different waves of it. It gets its own thing. However, there is a fundamental connection there, which is Stoic psychology, which of course was intuitive psychology, right? I mean, the time they didn't do experiments or controlled conditions or anything like that. So it was all intuitive. But it is essentially the picture we get from Stoic psychology is very similar to what we get from cognitive science today, which is that what we call emotions are, at least the complex, mature emotions, are in part cognitive. Okay, that is, there is a cognitive component to it, and therefore you can argue with your own emotions. You can actually think through it, and you can say, wait a minute, hold on a second. You can say to the impression, wait, you're not what you look like. Now, the Stoics did realize, as modern cognitive sciences also agree, that certain emotional responses are automatic, and there's nothing you can do about it. Seneca, for instance, on anger, writes that the first movement, what he calls the first movement of anger, is uncontrollable. You just nothing you can do. It's that sort of internal sensation of, I'm getting really upset here. There's something really is not going on, right? He says, don't even think about trying to suppress that or control that, because it's just like blushing. You don't have any control over it. However, anger then quickly develops into a partly cognitive emotion, and say, oh yeah, I should be upset about this thing because that guy is a jerk and he treated me that way. There is where you can act. There is where you can say, hold on a second, what's going on here? I'm getting upset and more worked up because what? Somebody cut me off on the highway? That's their problem, not mine, right? Nothing happened. There was no accident, nothing. So why am I worried about this kind of thing? And so you come to terms with your emotional responses that way. That is why, by the way, it's really not accurate at all to say the Stoics try to suppress emotions. We don't suppress our emotions because, as you know, again, that's not possible. It would be it's just not going to happen. What we try to do is to manage our emotions by way of engaging the cognitive component, right? And trying to move through practice, trying to move away from what Stoics consider unhealthy emotions, such as anger, fear, things like that. And also, however, toward a mindful cultivation of what we consider healthy emotions: love, joy, sense of justice, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the way it works. And now, going back to your question about CBT, so one way to think about it is that, of course, CBT is a therapy. And therefore, it's typically, you tell me, since you're the one that actually do it, but typically, from what I understand, it is tailored to specific problems, right? And it's supposed to be a short-term kind of thing. This is not the Woody Allen style therapy that you're supposed to do for 50 years.
The therapy itself, yeah.
Right, the therapy itself. It's like it's targeted. So you have a problem, you have a phobia, you have a depression, you have whatever it is. You go to the therapist helps you work your way through this thing. And after a number of sessions, that could be weeks or months, but not decades. You're supposed to reassess the situation, see if you actually have improved. That's the difference with Stoicism. Stoicism is not a therapy; it's a philosophy of life. So it's for life. It's lifelong.
Stoicism is the ultimate toolkit.
Right, and it doesn't. Stoicism is not focused on specific issues. It's useful for anything that might happen to you, right? So there are situations where you might still want to go to a therapist as a Stoic, and say, "Look, I can't get out of this. I'm going through a phase of depression, for instance." Or, of course, also if you have diagnosable conditions such as bipolarism or something like that, then you have to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist even. Right. But I have a friend, a colleague, Lou Marinoff, who actually wrote this really pretty funny book called Plato, Not Prozac, where he pushes sort of philosophical counseling. It's not really therapy, it's a philosophical counseling. But at the beginning, despite the title of the book, at the beginning, Lou says, look, sometimes you need Prozac or whatever chemical, right? Because if your mind is in a situation, a state that it cannot work. You cannot work through your processes. You cannot process your cognitive, aspect. Then you need the pill. You need to, or whatever it is that's going to helpful and bring you down to a normal, more or less normal function. But once you're there, you're still going to have the problems of how do I deal with my relationships?
Yes.
What do I want to do in life? All of those things are still going to be there, and the pill isn't going to tell you.
Right. Good point. You were talking about suppressing of emotions, which is something that I figured you probably are asked so often. Since it was the first question that I thought of, I knew that it's something you probably get asked really often.
Right.
But just to tell me if I'm reflecting in somewhat of a lay terms, maybe, but still correctly. It's not suppressing emotions. It's not even really suppressing negative emotions, except to the extent that you don't want to fan the flames of negative emotions. You're going to have natural, evolutionarily predisposed reactions to things.
Right.
But what you're trying to do is make room for as many positive emotions as you can by not letting the negative ones bog you down or go on for any longer than they need to.
That's correct. And also, I think part of the approach, the Stoic approach to the negative emotion, to the unhealthy emotions, is you're trying to disperse them, to make them milder, to just make them. You wait until they go away,
right?
And then you argue with yourself and say, "Look, you really should prepare yourself for this kind of thing." So, for instance, Seneca again says, on anger, don't engage cognitively with anger while you're angry, because that's not going to work.
Right.
That's like saying, if you're a friend who is getting angry and you say don't get upset, he's going to get more upset. It's like that's just not going to work. So what do you do with your friend? Well, you distract him. You bring him out for a while. You say, okay, let's go out for a walk. Let's get a drink. Let's do something else that is going to calm you down. Once you calm down, in other words, once the anger has actually subsided on its own, because there's not much you can do about it otherwise, then you start, okay, now let's talk about this thing. Why exactly were you getting upset? Was it really that important, etc.
Right.
Now you're calm. And so now you can reason about things. That's the Stoic approach.
No, so when I'm dealing with, I work with kids in addition to working with adults with addictions. And one of my best strengths is being able to de-escalate a kid who's just really off the wall. And what I'll do, of course, is listen actively to the child. So I'm actually reflecting deeply what they're telling me the problem is. So distracting might be a method that I use, but it's more like I'm making sure that they feel a sense of control and that and that somebody else understands the emotion that they're feeling. And in that sense, then we could start, kind of like you're saying, then we can start talking about the real issue at hand once things are calmed down. Exactly. Is there an element of that? I feel like there is, but I maybe can't articulate it. Is there an element of that in Stoicism, except this is an internal dialogue?
Right. So the notion is, the approach is similar, but it is an internal dialogue. And in fact, one of the things that the Stoics suggest to do, especially in modern Stoicism, is because you want to practice internal dialogue, you should do it in ways that are efficacious. And one way it is efficacious is to write things down, right? So journaling becomes an important thing, right? Because if you just argue with yourself in your mind, it's pretty easy to fool yourself. It's pretty easy to rationalize things. But once you start running them down and black on white, it's like, wait a minute, what the hell am I writing here? That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Number one. Number two, the advice is to do the journaling in second person, right? As if you were actually writing to a friend. Why? Because the idea is that if you journal, a lot of people journal in the first person and they get all caught up again in the emotional responses, right? They relive their emotional responses. That's not a good thing as far as the Stoics are concerned. What you want to do is to actually take some distance. And one way to take some distance from your emotional responses is to write to yourself in the second person. So when I write in my diary, I say, oh, so you got upset about this today. What the hell was going on with you? What were you thinking? You know, et cetera, et cetera. The notion there being that, in a sense, you're kind of talking to a child, right? The child being yourself upset. When you were upset, when even an adult human being, when we are upset, we actually behave like a child. We want attention. You know, we want things that probably we can't get, right? That's why you get upset. That's why you get angry. So you talk to yourself as if you're actually talking to a child, in a sense. And you say, you de-escalate, and then you say, okay, but really.
So you're having this Socratic dialogue on your own. Yeah, that's great. Our time's limited, but I did want to get to this one thing that I was really interested in. I think I heard you talking about it on an interview. Might not be getting this totally right, but if I am, then it has implications for something I'm interested in, which is restorative justice. And I think it's, to paraphrase you, you were saying something like the Stoics believe that people aren't wrongdoers, you know, knowingly. You know, it's usually out of ignorance or out of the lack of wisdom that they behave badly. And I'm interested
that comes out of a Socratic phrase. So Socrates at one point says that the root of all evil is ignorance. And the Stoics consider themselves Socratics. So they actually took that and run with it. Now, the first thing to clarify is, by ignorance, Socrates didn't mean if you don't go to college, you're evil, or something like that. Or if you don't, you know, it wasn't talking about factual knowledge. He was talking about wisdom. In fact, the word that he uses, amatia in Greek, it translates as unwisdom. So what he's saying really is that the root of evil, of all evil, is lack of wisdom, okay? Is that people do things that are not wise. So the Stoic perspective on that is that when somebody does something wrong, they don't do it on purpose, because if you talk to them, they would actually explain to you reasons for why they're doing that. They think that they're doing the right thing, okay? So the jerk that cuts you off the highway, for instance, right, and you get upset, if you talk to him, he will probably say, hey, I'm in a hurry and, you know, I have an appointment, or you know, my wife is delivering my baby in the hospital, or even something as lame as, hey, I'm not a schmuck like you. I can just cross other people and, you know, get ahead, right? Even then, he still thinks and has reasons for it. He thinks that from his perspective, those are good reasons, right? So the Stoics basically use that for anything. Anybody who does something bad or quote unquote evil, they're actually not doing it on purpose. Now, if that's the case, that means you have two options. You either teach them or endure them, as Marcus Aurelius says, right? So the first thing, of course, if somebody is doing something that actually is affecting, you know, harming other people, then the first thing the Stoics should do is to actually stop it. Okay.
So reductio ad absurdum being like a serial killer or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to say, oh, well, he's doing what he thinks is right, so whatever, right? No, you're not doing whatever. You're obviously going to stop him if you can. But after that, you don't say on top of that, you don't say, oh, and that was an evil thing to do. No, he was doing whatever his nature brought him to do. And so he should actually be treated as a sick person. Epictetus directly makes the analogy with a blind person. He says, you know, you call these people murderer and thieves and stuff like that. But what do you mean exactly? You mean that they're doing something that they think is right, but you think is actually not right. So in a sense, they're like a blind person who walks down the street and start bumping into other people and hurting other people, right? Well, would you put the blind person to death because he's blind? No, you try to help him. You try to say, hey, you're hurting other people, don't do it. And then if possible, you're trying to cure his blindness. If not, you're going to try to put him in a situation where he's not going to be hurting himself or other people. So in that sense, the Stoics are very much into restorative justice and certainly not into punishment, right? You don't punish people. You don't exact revenge on people. because anybody could be in their position. You could have been in the same position.
Right.
Under similar circumstances, you might have done the same thing that they are doing. And therefore, you should be charitable and be constructive about things. Again, this does not mean at all that you should be a doormat and have other people walk all over you or let them hurt people. No, that's not what it is about. It's about not adding these hatred,
right,
of the person, not adding the punishment, the revenge thing that's going on so much, unfortunately, especially in American society.
Because see, as from a Stoic perspective, that would be just the potential for irrationality. Then, because if you're okay, you're locking a person up because they committed crimes, like you would lock an earthquake up if you could, so it wouldn't hurt anybody else. But saying, well, let's torture him too because what an asshole. You're not right. It's always the potential you're getting something wrong there, and you're doing the wrong thing. Yeah,
you're doing the wrong thing. Yeah, you're reacting in the wrong way. You're not helping the actual situation. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate everything that you've given me and my listeners here today, and I appreciate your time. There's a ton more I could talk to you about. I wonder if just two more quick things. One, would you please talk about is it a forthcoming book or is the book already been published?
Just came out a few weeks ago. It's called A Field Guide to a Happy Life, published by Basic Books. And basically what it is on the one hand, an homage to Epictetus, because it's about the Enchiridion. It's about Epictetus' manual. But on and that's, as I said before, that's because I think Epictetus needs to be better known today. I think that people will benefit from learning about Epictetus. But at the same time, it's also my personal attempt to update Stoicism to the 21st century. Because of course, Stoicism, started out 2,300 years ago, and a lot of stuff has happened in the meantime. And just like in the same way in which nobody's a Buddhist today in the way people were Buddhist 2,000 years ago, or a Christian, and so on and so forth, then Stoics, modern Stoics also need to update a few things. So basically, the field guide is a rewriting, a section by section rewriting of the Enchiridion, where it's not a new translation because there's very, very good translations out there already. It's a rewriting, meaning that I use the same concepts, similar concepts and similar situations, but I update it to the 21st century. So I let go of certain things that I don't think work very well anymore in Stoicism, and I replace them in what I hope is a coherent sort of fashion.
Well, I hope people will buy the book. I'm going to as soon as we log off, actually. So thank you. And I wanted to, anything else you'd like to link to in addition to your Patreon page, because I shouldn't tell you this, but I'm glad it works for you. But just after a month, for a $3 subscription to your Patreon, I've gotten more value than my last 2 years of New York Times subscription. So
I'm glad to hear that. That page is there because I have a compulsion to write. I mean, I just can't stop myself. So I write like as you've seen, 2 or 3 essays per week.
That's great.
In fact, just before we started this conversation, I was finishing the one for tomorrow morning. And I figure, people might actually find them interesting. So other than my Patreon page, you can find anything, pretty much everything about what I write, my podcasts, my interviews, whatever, at massimopigliucci.com. It's a sort of one site that has everything that you can possibly want to know.
And the most recent podcast, I'm so sorry that I don't know about this.
It's called Stoic Meditations.
Oh, okay.
And it's available on 13 different platforms.
Oh my gosh.
Spotify. And what it is it's essentially a daily podcast. It's almost 5 times a week. I don't do it during the weekend. It's a very short thing. Every episode is like 4 or 5 minutes. It's very short. And it is literally a meditation. It is what I do every morning. I get up in the morning and I open a random passage from one of the Stoics. I read it and then I meditate. I think about it. I reflect about what it means in general terms and also in terms of my life. Once I started doing that, I figured, some people might actually find this useful.
That's outstanding.
Yeah. So right now there are, I think at the last count, there are 750 episodes out, and for a total of something like 5.5 million downloads. So apparently people do find it useful.
It must be so. Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, thanks again for everything you've given us today. And I'll let you know when the show's out and link to all those things in the show notes.
Great. Thank you.